So I want to start with an email I received early on when I was sending out initial notices of the conference. And it read, are you CBT therapists who want to put CBT under the microscope, or psychoanalytic dinosaurs who have an axe to grind? Well, the writer was prescient, because looking around, there are indeed plenty of dinosaurs here. And I believe I see some of the psychoanalytic variety on that table there. Well, dinosaurs, you too are welcome. But there is a serious point to be made here, which is that it is in exactly this way that all criticism of CBT gets construed and contemptuously dismissed. The attitude begins, the sound's being a bit crap. Okay, so the attitude begins with the premise that as CBT is a science, then any criticism of it must be by definition anti-science. But there does remain a very real and reasonable question and debate to be had. What do I need to do?
Use the lectern mic.
This lectern mic, okay. So, not even that. So there remains a very reasonable question about which psychological treatments the public purse should fund and on what basis. Well, Layard and Clark say that it should only be the evidence-based therapies. They have laid claim to the scientific high ground, from which they discount all that does not fall into their narrow parameters of evidence as superstition. To my mind, the decision as to what counts as evidence is ideological, and the version of scientific evidence that they have settled on is fundamentalist. And one way of grasping the absurdity of this fundamentalist position is as follows. I've decided on an experimental protocol to distinguish that which is food from that which is not. To this end, I've decided that only those substances that I can pick up with chopsticks will count as food. So according to this protocol, soup can never count. It matters not to me that you've eaten soup and been nourished by it, because this form of evidence falls outside my experimental protocol. I think it anecdotal and hearsay. Your form of verification, which is your experience, you did ingest it, you enjoyed its taste, you felt nourished, your hunger was assuaged, you did not die. None of this counts in my paradigm. Well, if it's just silly old me that thinks this ridiculous thing, then it is not so important for the fate of the world. But if powerful persons, disciplines, institutions, and governments also come to think this and advocate for it, then this way of proceeding has become a paradigm. Paradigms powerfully lock in certain ways of thinking and practicing as legitimate, and in the same moment exclude and lock out everything else. However ridiculous the chopstick protocol, this is nevertheless exactly what has been taking place in regards to CBT and NICE. None of the alternatives are granted a voice in the overly medicalized frame of reference legitimated by NICE. To the CBT paradigm, the form of psychotherapy I practice is soup, and because it cannot be grasped by its positivist chopsticks, it does not exist. For many decades, the psychotherapy field used to be more of a free-for-all, constituted by a range of schools jostling with each other. Sure, power relations pattern the relationship between them, with psychoanalysis positioning itself as being ruler of the roost. But on the whole, it was a kind of liberal live and let live situation. And by live and let live, I do not mean that I think all therapies to be equal but different. I do have fundamental disagreements with many premises and forms of practice that abound, including certain schools of psychoanalysis. I might well argue with them, but if others find it amenable, then on the whole, that is okay with me. This is also true of CBT. CBT is not my cup of tea. In fact, its conception of the human condition offends me. But if someone wants to practice it, and another finds it helpful, and it is helpful to some degree, then that too is fine with me. But now the situation has changed. The New World Order is no longer liberal but fascistic, and would strangle and kill off all other forms of therapy. The transition is akin to that of moving from a liberal democracy, with all its attendant problems, to a draconian, totalitarian regime, the ethos of which is my way or no way. It is this declaration of war on my professional being that has incensed me sufficiently to set up this conference. But the initial impetus for this event came about a couple of years ago when we attended a conference here in this very room in Dartington on the theme of happiness. On arrival, we were greeted by a number of people, each carrying a placard announcing, "Get free hugs here." Over 2 days, we were repeatedly informed that there was now a science of happiness and that one could learn the skills to be happy. The great scientific discovery behind the offer of a free hug was that happy people tend to have more physical contact than unhappy ones. Well, in following this course, these researchers had forgotten the very first lesson of empiricism, that correlation is not causation. For example, we observe a dog wagging its tail. We notice that only happy dogs wag their tails. We notice that unhappy dogs do not wag their tails. We deduce from this that if unhappy dogs wag their tails, they would become happy. We develop a treatment protocol to teach unhappy dogs to wag their tails. When these dogs learn to wag their tails, they will become happy. The offer of 3 hugs is born out of exactly this kind of error. A hug is no simple decontextualized mechanism. I do not feel better for hugging anonymous strangers. That would be a form of prostitution. On the other hand, I do feel better when I hug and am hugged by those who are meaningful to my emotional life. The impulse to hug is an expression of a feeling of tenderness towards another, and not simply a mechanical cause of my well-being. This way of proceeding is made possible by CBT's shift in focus from the internal psychological world to the surface of things, to what is visible and allegedly measurable. This they have done in order to present themselves as natural scientists. Human interiority has no place in this new world order, in which CBT parodies psychoanalysis and the other therapies as only occupied with obsessively looking for the root causes of psychological disturbances. This, they say, is pointless because, quote, if you want to put out a fire, then you had better tackle what keeps it going, heat, fuel, oxygen, and so on, rather than look for the match that started it. In this way, CBT makes a radical dichotomy between cause and maintenance and positions itself on the latter pole. Layard and Clark say, it is not necessary to know what caused cancer, you cure it by cutting it out. Similarly, infections are often cured with antibiotics without knowing their causes. A key consequence of proceeding in this way is that much of human life is stripped of its meaning, and meaning is what makes my work meaningful. My hope for this conference is that it will consist of something more than the dissemination of information, which is important, and the venting of ire. I hope that it will also be to some degree a campaigning conference which will be able to make some contribution to challenging the current state of affairs in the psychological therapies. Well, as you can tell, I could go on, but my duties as host requires that I stop and give some of the other dinosaur speakers a chance to speak.